attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to this month's Leadership Perspectives webinar. I'm Shelley Wilsey, the Director of the International Leadership Association and your moderator today. Before we start, please note the following. First, this presentation will be archived, so if you missed something, you can review it later on demand. Watch your email box for instructions on how to do so. Second, questions are welcomed. Simply type them into the questions box of your webinar control panel, which is currently displayed on the right-hand side of your screen. We will address questions during the second portion of the webinar. Please note, however, that we may not have time to address every question, so please don't be shy about sending your question in soonest. Now, I'm pleased to introduce our webinar presenter, Ruthellen Josselson. Ruthellen is a professor of clinical psychology at the Fielding Graduate University and a psychotherapist in practice. She is also co-director of the Yalom Institute for Psychotherapy, through which she has recently directed training programs on group psychotherapy in China, Israel, and Greece. She's a founder and president-elect of the Society for Qualitative Inquiry in Psychology, a member of the Executive Committee of the American Academy of Group Psychotherapy, and editor of the new journal to be published by the American Psychological Association called Qualitative Psychology. Her research passions focus on women's identity, human relationships, and qualitative research methodology. Over the last dozen years, Ruthellen has written or co-authored 13 book chapters, plus she has authored or co-edited 15 books, including most recently Transforming Self, Transforming Institutions, The Life and Leadership Lessons of Faith Gabelnick, which is the launching point for today's webinar on Transforming Self, Transforming Institutions, Collaborative Leadership and Group Dynamics. So without further ado, please welcome our webinar presenter, Ruthellen Josselson.
Well, thank you very much, Shelley, for that introduction. I am very delighted to be here, although I have to say I haven't ever done this before, and I can't see anybody, so I can only see my own screen. I feel a bit like I'm talking to myself, but I will do my best and look forward to whatever questions or input people would like to offer later. I'm talking today about transforming self and transforming institutions, and my launching point is the idea that leadership is fundamentally a relationship between the leader and those who follow. But in most organizations, because few followers have much direct relationship with their leader, the relationship between leader and follower is largely held internally through internal representations. This demands complex psychological processes on the part of the leader, who must at some level integrate a personal sense of self, which includes an understanding of the origin of that self and its blind spots, and an awareness of the multiple ways in which she is being imagined, experienced, and represented by her followers. But this is often a painful and shame-filled process, so few leaders have had the courage to examine these dynamics very, very openly. And we have an opportunity today to look at how this works in the life of one particular leader, whose name is Faith Gabelnick. And I'm going to be speaking from a book that I did on the leadership lessons of Faith Gabelnick. I'm going to show you a picture of her. She is the tall one on the right. I am with her as the short one on the left. She is important because she was a pioneer in group relations in the U.S., who used her group relations learning to be a transformative leader within the educational system. She died at age 60, just after stepping down as the first woman president of Pacific University. And this is just a summary of some of her important leadership roles. Before she was president of Pacific University, she was an assistant director of the Honors College at the University of Maryland, then dean of the Honors College at Western Michigan University, then provost of Mills College. So she had gone stepwise to yet more authorized roles within higher education before reaching the highest level. She was also the first woman to direct the National A.K. Rice Conference and the first woman president of the A.K. Rice Institute. At each step, she used her increasing learning about groups, about leadership, and about the relationship between person and role to help her make sense of difficult leadership situations. She also wrote extensively about her theory of an approach to collaborative leadership. Now, I had the extraordinary opportunity to interview Faith for more than 20 hours over a period of 5 months, during which she knew she would soon die of cancer. This was a very meaningful experience for both of us. Faith had been my mentor in group relations work. The impetus for me to do these interviews was that I felt that I had not yet learned all I could from her, and so talking to her was a last-ditch attempt on my part to preserve her knowledge. The impetus for her to do this was that she had admired my work on women's development, and she felt she had something to say about her own biography that was intertwined with her leadership. And because she was dying, there was no reason for her to hold back any of her insight. So often when people write books about leadership who are already leaders and alive, the books are fairly self-serving about how they were such a good leader. But Faith was really interested in examining the intersection between her person and her roles and what one could learn from that about leadership. So what I hope to do in this talk is to reflect on Faith's understanding of herself as a person, her insights into her own development, and how that was manifest in the way she took up her roles. I'm particularly interested in focusing her insights so that they might be instructive for you who are listening, and to think about how who you are influences how you lead. In this presentation, I will use Faith's words liberally, because I think they're evocative and make her more present, and I'll try to indicate with my voice and my speech when I'm speaking my words and when I'm speaking hers. So in describing herself most generally, Faith said, quote, "I've always been an outsider. I've always been different in the environment in which I was. Always the outsider. Being Jewish, the only girl in a lot of things, the first woman president, it's very much a theme of being an outsider. Not as a victim. I do not see myself as a victim, ever." Faith was born in 1943 to people who were in their mid-20s and who had never gone to college. I was the first grandchild. I was the first granddaughter of a first daughter of a first daughter. We were the first of things. My mother never felt that my father was very smart, and my father always felt that she was very smart. My father adored my mother. He idealized her. I grew up in a maternal household, and I grew up being adored, being taken care of by a number of people, my extended family. My grandparents were thrown out of their apartment because of anti-Semitism when people started coming back from the war, and they moved in with us. I think that propelled my father to look for another job. He got a job in Connecticut as a draftsman for machines, and he eventually became head of a little company that made these machines. He was a self-taught engineer. He drew beautifully, he painted, he danced, he was very good athletically, he sang, and he thought he was stupid. My uncle got married when I was 5, and I was the only child at their wedding. My mother's brother worked for a company which made exquisite children's dresses. I was there at the wedding dancing or something, and I always remember falling, slipping. It was just too much for me to be the center of attention. So what I remember was the gorgeous pink dress and the mortification of falling down. That is, in a sense, a paradigm for me. In other words, the center of attention and tripping. So this is what happened to me over and over and over. The psychologist Todd Schultz writes about prototypical scenes as setting a kind of theme for a life. And Faith clearly felt that the scene of being the center of attention and falling was a theme that repeated throughout her life. Her successes in leadership, then, always carried the threat of imminent falling and shame. At the same time, her early experiences of being different and being the first underlay her taking on a first role many times as a leader. She had come by her first role biographically and learned to tolerate the experience of being different, an experience which led her to assert rather than to hide her differences. So the first leadership lesson here is to learn to tolerate being different. And the second is that the excitement of being adored entails special risks of falling and bearing shame. The second prototypical scene in Faith's early life was about persistence and overcoming obstacles. And here's her words again. My sister was born when I was 3. I remember I was on the stairs outside our apartment, and I yelled down that she had to go back to the hospital because I did not want a baby sister. I wanted a baby brother. I always had this very ambivalent relationship with my sister. I'm much more of a risk-taker and a mover-outer, and she's more self-consumed, I would say. She took her lead from me, adored me, and wanted to hang around me, and I wanted just to not have a baby sister hanging around me. My father got a job in a tiny town in Connecticut. I was suddenly ripped away from a life that I was beginning to shape, so I had to start all over again. The Christmas play came, and my teacher wanted me to have the role of Mary, which was evidently a major role in this Christmas play. So I came home very excited about this, and my mother says, "You can't be Mary, you're Jewish. You can't be in the Christmas play." How does an 8-year-old understand this? So I went back and I said, "I'm Jewish and I can't be in the Christmas play." This was like 1950, McCarthy times, and my teacher actually screamed. She never met a Jew. The children thought I had horns. Kids asked me if I drank the blood of children. It was kind of amazing, but she was resourceful. She said, "Okay, you can't be Mary, but we'll have you just be the role of the narrator." I was a minority, and I could have turned that into being a victim. Instead, what I did was I clung to my identity. I gave talks when it was Hanukkah. I got up on the stage, and here 10 years old to an old Christian audience carrying on about Hanukkah. I just became kind of an advocate to be Jewish. I'm an atheist. I don't believe in this religiously, but as part of claiming who I am, I stand up and I speak, and I've always done that. When I was in high school, there were 1,600 people in my class. And in my class, there were 580 people. There's one Jewish girl, and that's me, and there's one Jewish boy. I thought it was terrible that we were having tests on Yom Kippur, and we're having dances on Friday night. I felt in principle this was wrong, and I had them change it. I talked to the teachers, and I talked to the principal, and I said I didn't think it was right, and they changed it. I don't know why they did that. I had a friend who had a piano at 7, and I wanted to play the piano. I loved music, and my mother said we couldn't afford it. The children say they want to play the piano, but they really don't pursue it. They don't keep it up, and she couldn't make that kind of investment. But there were neighbors who had a piano, and my mother arranged for me to practice on their piano. By now I'm 9. I had to ask for permission. They had 2 teenage boys. I was terribly intimidated. They were eating, and I was trying to practice, feeling like an idiot because, playing stupid songs and making mistakes, and it was mortifying. But my parents did eventually get me a piano. My teacher said I had a lot of talent to be a professional pianist, and my mother said, "You don't want to do that. You just want to play for parties. You don't want to work too hard." The word from my mother was never take anything seriously and don't work too hard. That was their message. Don't work hard. You're killing yourself. Don't work so hard. When I was in high school, the question was, should I take Latin to go to college? At one level, she said, "We always thought you would go to college. We thought you should go to college." But on the other level, my mother said, my father would say this too, "There's nothing wrong with being a secretary, learning shorthand." When it came time for college, I wanted to be a physician. I got no support from anybody. My parents said they didn't have enough money to send me. But Faith had a supportive English teacher who encouraged her. Faith's words, "I'd bring these catalogs to my mother, and my mother would say, 'There are rich people there. They'll have their own cars. There are no Jews there, and you won't be happy there.'" I was totally passive, totally in my mother's clutches. Having these sparks that came from somewhere of vision and ambition and drive and other things in my own personality, but no will from my own self. So after twisting myself in an absolute pretzel, I went to Simmons and enrolled in a nursing program. At Simmons, the reading Faith did opened new worlds for her. This was the beginning of the transformation theme which pervades her life. She met Henry Gabelnick, and she said, "We were made for each other. He was very much like my mother, and I was looking for somebody who would keep me down. I needed a very strong person to keep me in place. He was 3 years older. He was the brother I never had. We decided, since I don't know anything, the best area for me to major in would be English. It was 1961, and how was I going to separate? And so I got married. That's the paradox of it. My road to individuation was through someone who was just like my mother." I always carried this sort of anti-ambitious strain, which was how my parents kept me down. My father says, "Look, it was bad enough we put you through college. What's this master's degree business? What do you need that for? You need children." It was a very limited view. I thought I could be wrong. Maybe all this career stuff is really stupid. I should have children and it will change me. And so I got pregnant. Faith followed Henry's job to Washington in 1968 and had her first daughter, joined a consciousness-raising group, and decided that she would get divorced in 10 years. She somewhat passively backed into a doctorate program at American University and got her doctorate in English 2 years later, writing about women. She said, "I didn't want to teach in an English department. I didn't want to go a traditional route, getting closeted with narrow people who only thought about literature in a certain way. I was in a humanities group at the Psychoanalytic Institute, and I was the only woman in the group who was outspoken. I said, I don't agree with this interpretation. I think there are other ways of understanding women's psychology. I was tolerated and also listened to a little. It was just at the edge when women all over the U.S. were challenging things." Faith eventually met Charles Furster and Margaret Rioch, who introduced her to group relations work. She was, as a 31-year-old woman, intellectually alive, a woman who had always felt herself to be an outsider with a family maternal lineage of being the first, and she had become a feminist. At the same time, she felt trapped by her mother's expectations of her, and increasingly aware of the ways in which her mother held her close out of envy and kept her down. She went to her first group relations conference as, she described herself, as a defiant, inquisitive, radical self. "I came back changed in a lot of ways. I was disoriented, very energized, very excited, feeling as if I had begun to find my place in the world. I began to use that work immediately. I designed a course for doctoral students and convinced the English department at American University to allow me to offer it. I was looking at space, time, environment, and person and role, and how one creates a class, a teaching environment." Within a year of going to her first conference, Faith began taking up staff roles in group relations conferences. She began thinking in system dynamics terms, experimenting with forms of leadership in her roles as a teacher at the University of Maryland. As she was transforming herself, she began also more assiduously trying to transform the institutions of which she was a part. While at Maryland, she met John Howarth, who became her mentor, work partner, guide, and eventually her husband. They collaborated on experientially based teaching and began consulting and doing workshops at universities for faculty all over the country. She co-taught with students and mentored them and did faculty workshops. All this in the face of the administration's resistance to the radical approaches they were taking to education. Faith was aware during their workshops of how differently she and John, who was 20 years her senior, were perceived. They fit together well. She brought the structure and process, and he brought the here and now. Faith would often give the conceptual material, and John would manage the group. But she was very aware of how differently they were perceived. She said, "I remember I gave the stand-up lectures, and John was taking a more minor role, and this guy came up to John and was so complimentary, and he turned to me and said, 'You know, there's nothing like a beard and British accent for authority.' And I was furious because, you know, I had done the theory part of this workshop, but he wasn't interested in me at all. He was watching John, interested in John's approval." But Faith, by this time, knew all about projections from her group relations work, where she had learned about how people create the other in complex ways. In addition, Faith had learned about being the one to manage boundaries between groups. This role suited her, and here she drew on her location of herself biographically as an outsider, as a Jew, and as a woman. She wrote, "Boundary leadership demands a particularly strong sense of self-authorization and an ability to be both part of and separate from others. Somehow I learned how to listen and not always get seduced, how to teach but not lecture, how to translate somewhat regressed formulations into honorable requests." This process of self-authorization occurred at every boundary. Faith related this to her autobiographical challenge of separating and individuating from her mother. She reflected on the psychological pressure on women who manage the boundary and grappled for what she called a kind of maternal stance which embraces and enables. Women's ambivalent relation to their mothers is here most strongly tested. The boundary demands that we yield in some way and yet remain intact. Faith's learning about managing boundaries was put to the test after she left Maryland to accept the role of director and then dean of the Honors College at Western Michigan University. She said, "I learned that a process of isolation and rebellion of a program is not a good strategy, and I learned that you have to be at the table. You have to be connected with the highest level of authority in an organization, and you have to be credible. I learned about the politics of leading an organization, and you have to engage your colleagues so their envy doesn't spill over into aggression." In this role, Faith was able to use what she had learned personally about separation and individuation to keep the Honors College both separate and integrally part of the university. In order to do this, she worked to include students from all of the colleges at Western Michigan, not just arts and science, even though this idea met great resistance. She said, "I hired as the director someone who was extroverted, who knew all the faculty and could wheedle them to participate. And, these are things you never know are going to work for you, he had a sister who was 18 months older than me, and he had a very good relationship with her. And when I spoke, he heard his older sister, and he obeyed." What I learned from my Maryland experience and my group relations experience was you have to work together. You have to listen to other people, even if you don't agree with them. In her 6 years there, Faith built and transformed the Honors College, with major effects on the whole university in terms of enrollment and reputation. She counted these as very successful years and was ready to take on the next challenge, that of being provost at Mills College. "There, at Mills," she says, "I found a house divided against itself. There were many men who had voted for coeducation, and most of the women had not. So there were gender splits. We were getting students who were needing financial aid, so there were beginning to be great class splits. There were splits among the various identity groups, all vying for a place at the table. At that point, students would come to me with an absolute straight face and say, 'We as African American students cannot be prejudiced because we are the victims.' Those were the statements that were made to me. To me, they were so absurd, and yet these were students. They're learning. So I didn't confront them around it. I didn't say, 'Well, that's ridiculous,' because that wouldn't be helpful. So what we did is we had workshops, and we got grants on multiculturalism, and we brought in speakers, and we gave out grants to design courses that would begin to address a lot of this in an atmosphere of, you can't make it any better, we're inconsolable, we're right, and you don't know. I had a group of students come to me refusing to read Faulkner, who was racist. And what do you do with that? You talk with them, you reason with them, and many of the teachers were terrified. We lost faculty who didn't know how to work in a confrontational, aggressive environment. There was so much splitting going on, and I don't work well in a splitting environment." Faith had understood a lot about splits from her group relations experiences, but she found it difficult to navigate what seemed to her to be endless confrontation. She lost 15 pounds and became very depressed. Quote, "I get the faculty male-female situation settled, and then the alumni went up in arms. I would talk to people individually about the fact that there were different identities. Certain people chose to have an identity, and as women we needed to support that identity, and that Mills was not totally overrun by lesbians. That's what they felt, that it was a place for all students of all situations and beliefs. That's what our society is going to look like, and I wanted them to work with me to help that society flourish. It was a much more complex society than we had envisioned 2 years before. So I talked rationally, of course. That's the way I am, but it wore me down. And each day I felt that what I was trying to also do was build collaborative leadership on this campus, which didn't have collaborative leadership. I had to train the deans to be deans, to take up their own authority, which they couldn't do. We would meet every week, and they would say, faculty won't do such and such. And I would say, well, you're the dean. How are you configuring the role? How do you understand your authority? Let's talk about making decisions in this or that way. In order to do that, I let them talk a lot, and they would say, let's just make a decision and go with it. And then I'd say, no, we're not ready to do that, because there are too many elements involved in all this, and I want a more complex understanding. It was very hard for them because they had a mental model, which they protested, of a dictator. The provost was the dictator, and this time the provost wasn't the dictator. But when you're not the dictator, and you want people to think more about their process and who they are and what they bring to a role, then they just can't make a decision. It's the same old stuff. I think women leaders have that as a challenge. Working in a very split environment, every time you take one step, someone is characterizing that step in an extreme way. So the next leadership lesson is to recognize splits and avoid taking sides. This is something that Faith struggled with and ultimately became quite good at. And the fourth leadership lesson is that to transform institutions, one must know the pain of personal transformation. After her 3 years at Mills, Faith left to take up the presidency at Pacific University. She said, the faculty adored me. I was their #1 choice. The board was a little skeptical. I was the first woman, and there was an ecstasy you can't imagine. There was a euphoria and an idealization that could never be realized. The undergraduates thought I was in their pocket, which I wasn't. I wanted to bring things that were hot nationally and open up this little school. Half were supporting me and half weren't. And eventually the board that I built and the community that I served felt that I had transformed the university. There I was, the first woman president, Jewish. When I got there, there were trees and bark dust all around. This was an institution that felt in the backwaters and always said it needed more money. It needed more resources, more students, and yet the faculty felt that they were great faculty, great teachers. How do you bring with no resources? I'm coming in with $1 million deficit. The heroic vision of leadership is I'm going to come riding on the white horse and raising millions of dollars, and poof, all the problems are going to be solved. As it turned out, I raised more money than any president in the history of the institution. But the heroic vision of leadership is not my style, and it wasn't open to me. The board president said the place is so poor that it would look bad if you have an loud inauguration. I said I wanted it outside, and I want the community engaged. That was a defining moment. It was out on the lawn. People saw it. It wasn't sequestered. We had tents with cake. We had Native Americans drumming. We had an African American singing Amazing Grace. My daughters spoke. When I walked away, I was the president. And not only that, I was a mother. What people spoke about was not my inauguration address, but the fact of my children being up there and speaking. The anxiety was so high about having a woman president. They were so nervous that I would be inhumane and I would be cold. The idea that my children seemed normal, my parents were there, that my husband had been a physicist, softened and made me psychologically more available and more rounded. One of the first things I did was to plant flowers. I spent $1,500 to get hanging baskets. And I had in the spring a planting day, and we got donations of plants, and I invited the whole community out. And we were all together, which has been our trademark, and suddenly that place looked better, and we planted trees and the place figuratively began to bloom. Still, I always felt for the first 3 years I was always reapplying for my job. The board had this old view of leadership. It was clear to me that it was going to be a community, connection, and sustainability. These were the themes that I thought were important. I had a view from group relations work, how to build leadership, to be open and accessible. You need to problem solve together. You need to know each other. The defining moments in a presidency are minuscule. They are tiny little things, for better or worse, which shape an institution. Often you don't even notice them. It's how you put a vision, how you put your spirit into action. The first week, the students were complaining because the place they hang out in was closed at 10. I made it open till 12. I kept the gym open till 12. I got them grants they never thought they would get. I hired people to help them write grants. I sat with people and I encouraged them. I brought my authority, my vision, and also my passion to this little place. That doesn't mean everybody liked me. Arts and sciences nipped at my heels after the first 18 months. They whined for years, complaining they didn't have enough space. I'd give them some space, but they didn't thank me. Over 3 years, I replaced the lights and chairs, and they didn't thank me. It was this whining, insatiable group of people. I couldn't do anything about it. My psychology connected them with my parents, who were always critical, and no matter what I did to please them, they weren't pleased at some level. The expectation was so high that if I didn't go to one thing, I was suddenly cold. I was uninterested. They were afraid I couldn't fundraise. They were afraid of the masculine qualities. They were afraid I couldn't manage the budget. They were afraid of leaving their fate in a woman. That was on one side. On the other side, they were starving for affection and support. It was both. It was really amazing. On a campus that had 60% women students, especially the older men held a "can she do it" kind of thing, and the women were there saying I was going to be their new goddess. So there was a great splitting dynamic in force. One woman who was having a hard time getting a sabbatical called me directly, and I said, "Don't do this to me. I am president for all. Don't think that I am simply going to champion women's issues. I will, but don't split me." I had to say this to her directly. Another thing that I didn't do is that the previous president had a cohort of people called the barons. These were senior faculty members that he constantly consulted with, and he created great social class division. These were all from arts and sciences. He said they loved him from arts and sciences, and partly because he'd left them alone. I said I was not going to have any barons. When they invited me at the faculty meeting, a lot of the women said, "Now we're going to have baronesses." I said, "We're not having barons or baronesses. This is going to be a community where people are going to have equal voices." You can say that, and people say, "Yeah," but then when they're not part of a power-broking deal, they get furious. It was very difficult for me because I didn't elevate them because they were senior faculty members. I worked with anybody, so the people who cleaned the gardens got my attention as well as the people who taught chemistry. That was tremendously radical. When you have these small places, they like to hold on to their elitism and hierarchy, and I wouldn't have that. I interrupted the hierarchy. That must have incurred a lot of resentment. They always said to me, "No matter what we did to you, you never held a grudge." I didn't withhold. I raised money for arts and sciences. I didn't withdraw the resources. I didn't exercise power in a punitive way. I had to live with these criticisms, live with this ambivalence, and navigate it. It was never smooth. The other thing is that in a leadership organization, you need differentiation. And in arts and sciences, there were lots of splits, but they would rather project those onto me than deal with them, because they didn't want to argue among themselves. They knew that presidents come and go, and they knew that they'd be living with themselves for the rest of their lives. They blamed me because they didn't really want to share resources or reorganize. Faith struggled with the dilemmas of when you say that's enough and just use her power to make a decision. She had her own ambivalence. In the end, she felt one simply has to live with this as a leader, that it is ultimately unsolvable. Faith spent 7 years trying to manage these projections as the idealized mother, the depriving mother, the cold demagogue. As she stepped down, feeling that she had done what she came to do, She felt that she had succeeded in transforming Pacific University, at least as much as was possible. What further lessons about leadership can one take from Faith's life, experiences in group relations, and experiences in these highly authorized roles? First of all, she thought of leadership as transformation of institutions. Transformation rests on knowing who you are and being open to change. She also knew that the internal and external worlds are always connected. Her personal biography is a study in transformation. From the small-town outsider growing up in a world of limited vision to a world of unlimited possibilities. From her life, she learned that we have to let go of powerlessness, hopelessness, and despair and find a way, and this she brought to her institutional roles. She understood that the future is not fixed, that change is a natural part of life. Learning is a way of being. We need to be open to fundamental shifts of mind. Faith understood the pain of transformation, but attempted to lead it nonetheless. A second principle was her awareness of the protections women leaders invite as mothers. She said, "As I work at conferences and in my own life as a woman on the boundary, I now understand that I carry and embody the mother as experienced in a myriad of ways. For many, I am the mother they wish they had had. For others, I embody the dreaded mother of their childhood." These words are important. I cannot choose how I am perceived. This is the agony and the joy of being a female leader. I do not see the problem of women's self-authorization as a male versus female issue, but very much one of internal self-authorization in relation to the other females in our inner lives. Thus, Faith stressed her own complex internal efforts to separate and individuate from her mother, to see her mother as a woman like herself, or more precisely, as unlike herself, and to wrest psychological freedom from her influences and desires. She said, "The first authority figure in our lives was our mother, hated and loved, an unattainable ideal, and a denigrated, shameful object. An organization will try to defend itself against the negative danger that the mother represents, and try to gain nourishment from the positive qualities it needs to survive. Since women leaders are often the recipients of the group's fear and envy, they may find themselves isolated and not consulted about decisions. Their work ideas may be dismissed, ignored, or treated with contempt. At the same time, their company may be sought after, their person cherished. People may not engage them in conflict. Instead, they may idealize and preserve them. It is hard to break out of this network of projections. The woman in authority must try to understand and work with these paradoxes while keeping the work task clearly in focus. While these views about a woman leader have very little to do with the reality of her competence, they have a lot to do with the organization's psychological environment." Faith recognized the importance of her daughter's speeches at her presidential inauguration. She said, "Listening to the comments about my daughters, I began to understand that taking up this role as a woman meant being able to display the maternal as well as the phallic aspects of my character. Seeing my family gathered with me, the projections now included the good mother who worked in the suspicious tower on the 3rd floor of Marsh Hall, but who also could have the capacity to bring the good nurturance to reassure and sustain the community." Faith reflected a great deal on the profound resistances to female authority and fought these resistances. Women are inevitably seen as an earth mother with infinite patience and a depriving murderous Medea, a sphinx, aloof and unreasonable, and every woman an ideal person who can manage all tasks with aplomb. Somewhere else, Faith wrote, "The consultant meets herself or aspects of herself in the imaginations of the members who seem to speak to her private world, in which she hears familiar voices asking her to nurture, to be a lover, to provide care, humor, and to stop working a work role, and to take up the more familiar female roles. The challenge is not defending against the projections, but being able to hold both the projections that elevate and those that derogate. Women know intuitively that accepting leadership roles will put them into a position of envy and distrust. Faith's experience and eventual understanding of her mother's envy of her made her highly sensitive to envy in others. Part of this was her fear of being too much elevated, for she understood that this became a lightning rod for destructive envy. On the other side, she believed that women emerge as leaders of new paradigms of understanding, and also that the group wants the women to represent the stability that we much relinquish. Shifting from a battleground mentality to a more collaborative stance involves a willingness to make the roles more flexible and the boundaries between the subsystems more permeable. Providing a space for reflection, conversation, and integration enables us to work collaboratively. Entering a system, one must first come in respectfully and learn about power structures. Quote, "I'm not saying accede to them, but understand that you are walking into a complex interactive system, and you should understand how you're perceived." Faith was aware from her group relations work that she was perceived as very strong, as articulate, and a threat. Internally, that is not how she was perceiving herself. Quote, "I'm perceiving myself as without direction, just kind of flailing around, learning. And outside, people are perceiving me as very directive and as a leader." Recognizing the intricate connection between person and role, Faith always looked for the personal roots of her experiences in role. Reflecting on her early years at Pacific University, she said, "I felt Pacific was in many ways invisible to itself and to its communities. I unconsciously identified with the university and determined to shift the culture and renew its connections with its founding ideas." Faith had long struggled with invisibility as an outsider while growing up, and being in touch with her roots in some sense renewed her. When a president assumes office, multitudes of projections fly, and it is the president's responsibility to project one's own past and psychological architecture onto the university. In this presentation, I've tried to demonstrate the link between Faith's psychological architecture and her structural visions for the institution she led. Above all, Faith tried to embody collaborative leadership, inviting all sectors to the table, giving everyone a voice. This involves having a complex and deep enough understanding of one's various selves so that one's personal architecture is indeed recognizable in all parts of the system. She did this as a teacher, as a pioneer of learning communities, and as an administrator in higher education. So the final ideas that I hope you can take from this is, first of all, the transformation is painful. Don't let anyone tell you it's not. That learning is a way of being, and this involves deep shifts in the way that one thinks. And finally, that the leader must provide a space for reflection, conversation, and integration that enables us to work collaboratively. So I think I've stayed within my time boundary here, and am now available for questions.
Thank you, Ruthellen. This is Shelley, and I have a list of questions that people have sent in. And again, it's not too late if folks want to type in a question, please do. So first of all, could you contrast a little bit the experience with doing a narrative inquiry with someone who's well-versed in psychology and group relations as opposed to somebody who is not? Was this quite a different experience for you as a researcher and scholar?
Well, Faith's experience in group relations and her, she had a psychoanalysis, she had a psychoanalytic consultant through most of the time that she was a leader. Her capacity to understand both the conscious and unconscious processes in systems, I think, was extraordinary. And this final effort to do a very personal analysis of her person and her role and the institutions and communities that she served, I think was a monumental undertaking. And so my experience of talking to her was was extraordinary because I felt that she had so much wisdom and insight, and what I was trying to do was to somehow capture it and hold it so that I could continue to learn from it. And so I think what she offers is a way of reflecting on these matters, and that's what I tried to capture in the book, so that other people can do this. We don't hear this kind of talk. I don't hear this kind of talk very often from other leaders who tend to, say, I succeeded at this and I wasn't able to do that. But they don't have the systemic understanding which Faith had, and also this willingness to talk about even these very embarrassing aspects of her own life, her failures as well as her successes.
So Dan Edgar asks, these interviews portray authenticity with its accompanying vulnerability. What role does vulnerability play in collaborative leadership?
Well, I think that to the extent that, I think what Faith would say, now I'll try to channel her, I think that what Faith would say is that to the extent that one is aware of one's own vulnerability and knows how that's being manifest, one doesn't then have to project that onto the others with whom one is being collaborative. So that the systemic view is that vulnerability exists all around, and that in order to collaborate, one has to be able to bring one's anxieties in a direct way to an understanding of the collaboration, so that the kinds of power struggles that people sometimes get into when they try to collaborate are much lessened. I mean, we try to assume a lot of power if we feel vulnerable to losing all of our power. So if we really can share power, that means sharing vulnerability, which means owning our own part of it.
Thank you. And Catherine Bingham remarks, an amazing narrative. What a fascinating woman. What is the most challenging aspect of capturing the essence of an individual's life and leadership?
Oh, I think I would just say the capacity to be honestly self-reflective, to be able to be in touch with the dark sides of one's character, as well as the positive ones. And I don't know if Faith would have been willing or able to give these interviews if she didn't know she was dying. I think that had a lot to do with it. She really had a sense that, the reality is that when we started this, she had pancreatic cancer, so she was told that she had between 2 and 6 months to live. And we started these interviews after, almost a month on. So all the way through, we had no idea how much time we really had. And she did manage to live almost 6 months. So we finished the interviews. Where we were was kind of plotting out the book and what chapters there would be and how we'd organize it when she died. So that sense of the end, I think, was really important in her being able to speak this way.
The deadline. Tim Lorio says, thank you, wonderful talk. Do you believe the role of emotional intelligence is a key in the transformational process?
Absolutely. That's another way of putting all of this. This is emotional intelligence, this understanding that there are strong feelings that are operative in whatever system one is a member of or a leader of, and that being in touch with those is absolutely crucial. The thing that I learned from Faith over and over again in the time that I was working with her was that one had to be very aware of the emotional processes, but not drown in it. And I know that from my own experience of getting overwhelmed by emotional experience, particularly in group relations conferences, Faith would just say 2 simple words. She would say, think roll. And that has stayed with me all these years when I'm trying to do something and I get lost. I think, what is my role? What is the task? And then if you can somehow stay with that and still be aware of the emotions that are all over, you can stay stay sane and do the work.
A question from Elizabeth Kaysen, I think, might be broadening out a little bit on your overall research passion on women's identity. And she asks, why do women in leadership feel envy and distrust? I think we can accomplish more if we focus on collaborative efforts. In your research around women and identity, have you been able to draw any conclusions or hypotheses around why women in leadership feel envy and distrust?
They feel it coming towards them, or they feel it towards others? I'm not sure. I'm not sure I understand the question, because it could be on both sides, or it could be perceived as on one side or the other. Is there a way to clarify?
I'm not seeing a clarification. So, women
okay.
in. Oh, here it is. Towards oneself.
I'm sorry. Towards oneself, that other
Yes.
people are feeling distrustful and envious toward one. Yeah, I mean, I think that Faith really works that out in terms of this early relationship with one's mother, that it's a very complicated kind of relationship that mothers and daughters have, and the necessity of separating and individuating means coming to terms with envy, particularly, and distrust in various ways. So I think that what Faith would say is that she absolutely prizes collaboration, but too often what gets in the way of collaboration is that envy and distrust are denied. And those things are split off. That is, if we are collaborative, that means that we're not feeling any envy. And the effort to do that just pushes the envy underground and destroys the collaboration. But if one can acknowledge that there is always competitiveness or envy or distrust in any collaboration, and that it's everywhere, and you can know where it is, then you can work collaboratively, because it doesn't have to be enacted. You can call it and you can see it. And I think that this is where women have a hard time. This is now a more general view from my understanding of women's identity, is that women in our culture are raised with this idea that you have to be good and nice, which means that you have to deny or repress aggression, and you have to always be sweet and giving and charitable toward other people. And so that means that women don't learn how to manage their aggression, how to express it, or how to accept it. So it goes underground, and it actually becomes much more dangerous. If you watch men manage aggression, they learn this in the playground as little boys. They know how hard you have to hit somebody to get them to stop picking on you. But women learn interpersonal ways of dealing with aggression. And it's very pernicious, and it's hard to recognize, and it's camouflaged and hidden. And those are the things, it's the camouflaging that gets in the way of collaboration. Because what happens is that the situation is defined as a collaborative leadership situation, but meanwhile there's enormous power struggles or competition, and nobody can acknowledge it. So it goes underground and it destroys the collaboration.
So having finished this narrative inquiry with Faith, do you have a next step in your research agenda on this topic?
Well, not a professional one. A personal agenda is to continue to learn these lessons that I think Faith had already learned. I find myself drawing on her wisdom all the time, but my research on women's identity includes issues of leadership and what somebody nicely called emotional intelligence. But I really did this to preserve Faith rather than as a research agenda. I don't know where I would take it next. I suppose I hope that somebody else I would hope that somebody else might like to take this up and do another series of interviews with another woman leader who perhaps was able to reflect in a similar way. Because it would be nice to have a compendium of this. I think that it's something that other women can learn from, and I would hope that my listeners, I don't know how many or who are out there, but I would hope that people might just take some time to go for a walk or something and think about their own biography and what aspects of their personal architecture, as Faith put it, they see in their own institutions. Because how is your institution a mirror of you, and what aspects of your institution can you not find in your personal biography? Because those would be the things that you then would be unable to deal with. I think that's what Faith's message is, that person and role are always intricately bound, and the architecture in person and in institution are always going to mirror each other.
And with that, I'd like to bring a close to the questions. I can't think of a stronger ending to this terrific webinar. Thank you, Ruthellen, for a marvelous presentation and for helping to keep the work and life of Faith Gabelnick alive in all of us. And thank you, too, to all who attended.
Well, thank you for your attention.
Afternoon, evening, or morning, depending on where you are, time zone-wise.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you.